the Second World War with an armored force built for a different kind of war. Its army relied heavily on light vehicles, colonial experience, and limited industrial resources, then found itself fighting mechanized armies across the deserts of North Africa, the mountains of the Balkans, and the plains of the Eastern Front. The problem was not simply that Italy lacked good tanks. It needed everything behind those tanks as well: trucks to carry fuel and ammunition, tractors to move artillery, reconnaissance vehicles to find the enemy, and specialized machines capable of doing jobs ordinary vehicles could not. So Italian engineers adapted. When a tank could not carry a powerful enough gun, they mounted a larger one on its chassis. When a truck could not cross the desert, they built vehicles for long-range raiding. When ordinary wheels could not move heavy artillery, they turned to articulated tractors. This is the major Italian vehicle fleet of World War II, from the Tankettes that entered the war already outmatched, to the self-propelled guns and specialized machines that kept Italy fighting long after its original designs had fallen behind. We start with the vehicles that formed the foundation of Italy's pre-war armored force: Tankettes, L3/33 and L3/35. The L3/33 and its improved successor, the L3/35, were derived from the British Carden Loyd Tankette and produced in large numbers during the 1930s. Armed only with machine guns and protected by extremely thin armor, they were useful for colonial warfare and reconnaissance. But against modern anti-tank weapons, their limitations became obvious almost immediately. They gave Italy armored mobility in large numbers. What they could not give it was protection. And that distinction would define much of Italy's armored war: light and medium tanks. L6/40. The L6/40 was Italy's attempt to replace the Tankettes with a proper light tank, carrying a 20 mm autocannon in a small turret. It was more capable than the L3 series, but by the time it reached widespread service, enemy medium tanks were already becoming too well armed and armored for a vehicle of its size. Its chassis, however, would prove more useful in another role. M11/39. The M11/39 was Italy's first medium tank, but its design revealed how quickly Italian armored doctrine was changing. Its 37 mm main gun was fixed in the hull, while the turret carried only machine guns, severely limiting where the tank could bring its main weapon to bear. It entered combat in North Africa in 1940, and quickly demonstrated the weakness of that layout against more mobile opponents. M13/40. The M13/40 corrected the M11/39's most obvious flaw by placing a 47 mm gun inside a rotating turret. It became the backbone of Italian armored formations in the early North African campaigns, and was produced in greater numbers than any other Italian wartime medium tank. But the M13/40 carried another problem into battle: its riveted construction. When armor was struck hard enough, fragments from rivets and interior fittings could become lethal to the crew even when the plate itself was not completely penetrated. The tank could fight. The question was how long it could survive against increasingly powerful Allied weapons. M14/41. The M14/41 was a running improvement rather than a completely new tank, with a more powerful engine and desert-oriented modifications intended to improve performance in North Africa's punishing conditions. It retained the M13's 47 mm gun, and much of its basic protection, so the improvements could only go so far. M15/42. The M15/42 represented the final major development of Italy's wartime medium tank line. It received a more powerful engine and improvements intended to keep the design relevant against increasingly capable Allied armor, but timing mattered. By the time the M15/42 could enter service in useful numbers, Italy's strategic position was already collapsing. P26/40. The P26/40 was Italy's belated attempt to build a heavier, more modern tank, combining a 75 mm gun with substantially thicker armor than its predecessors. The problem was production. Development delays and industrial shortages meant that very few reached Italian units before the September 1943 armistice. German forces subsequently took control of surviving vehicles and continued to use the type. Italy had finally produced a tank closer to what the battlefield demanded. It had simply arrived too late. Standard tanks were struggling to keep pace with enemy armor. Italian engineers found another solution: Stop trying to make the tank turret do everything. Put the bigger gun directly on the chassis. Semovente self-propelled guns. Semovente 4730 seconds. The Semovente 4730 seconds mounted a 47mm anti-tank gun on the L6/40 chassis, creating a compact vehicle that could provide mobile anti-tank support without the weight and complexity of a full turret. It was lightly protected, but the concept was important. Italy was beginning to turn existing chassis into specialized weapons rather than waiting for entirely new tanks. Semovente 75/18. The Semovente 75/18 was the result of that philosophy taken much further. Its short-barreled 75mm howitzer was originally intended primarily for infantry support, but its low silhouette and powerful high-explosive ammunition made it surprisingly dangerous against tanks as well. It became one of the most effective armored vehicles Italy fielded during the war, not because it was a perfect tank destroyer, but because it solved several problems at once. It was compact. It was relatively easy to build, and it gave Italian crews a weapon their standard tanks often lacked. Semovente 75/34. The 75/34 pushed the concept toward dedicated anti-tank work, replacing the shorter gun with a longer-barreled 75mm weapon capable of greater penetration and better performance at range. The change reflected the battlefield itself. As Allied tanks became harder to defeat, Italian vehicles needed more than mobility and armor. They needed reach. Semovente 105/25. The 105/25 went further still, combining a powerful 105mm gun with a tank-derived chassis. It represented one of Italy's most ambitious attempts to turn an existing armored platform into a heavy assault weapon. But once again, production and timing limited its impact. Semovente 90/53. The Semovente 90/53 took a different route entirely. Instead of developing a new tank gun, Italian engineers mounted the powerful 90mm anti-aircraft gun on a tracked chassis and used it against armored targets. The weapon gave the vehicle exceptional anti-tank reach, but there was a price. Its open fighting compartment offered little protection, and its ammunition supply was limited. A powerful gun could compensate for an inadequate tank. It could not eliminate the logistical problems surrounding it. Self-propelled guns gave Italy more firepower. Reconnaissance required something different: speed, range, and the ability to escape before the enemy could bring heavier weapons to bear. Armored cars. Lancia 1ZM. The Lancia 1ZM was already an old design when the Second World War began, dating back to the First World War era. Yet Italy kept it in service because armies at war rarely have the luxury of replacing every obsolete vehicle at once. It remained useful for colonial policing, rear area security, and secondary duties even as newer armored cars entered service. Autoblinde AB40. The AB40 represented a much more modern approach. It used four-wheel drive and had driving positions at both ends of the vehicle, allowing the crew to reverse away from danger without turning the entire vehicle around. For reconnaissance crews, that could mean the difference between disengaging and being trapped. Its weakness was firepower. Armed mainly with machine guns, the AB40 was quickly shown to be underarmed for the increasingly dangerous encounters it faced. Autoblinde AB41. The AB41 solved that problem by fitting a turret armed with a 20mm autocannon. Combined with its four-wheel drive, long range, and dual driving positions, the AB41 became one of Italy's most capable reconnaissance vehicles. It was particularly well suited to the open spaces of North Africa, where speed and range could be more valuable than heavy armor. Autoblinde AB43. The AB43 was the final major development of the series, with a more powerful engine and heavier armament intended to keep the design competitive. But history repeated itself. The vehicle arrived just as Italy's ability to continue the war was collapsing, and only limited numbers were completed before and after the armistice. The AB series showed what Italian engineers could achieve when the requirement was mobility rather than heavy protection. The desert demanded an even more specialized answer: desert raiding vehicles. Camionetta AS-37. The AS-37 was designed for the unique demands of North African operations, where ordinary roads could disappear entirely, and patrols might need to operate far beyond the reach of conventional supply columns. Its emphasis was simple: carry men, weapons, fuel, and water farther into the desert. Camioneta AS-42, Sahariana. The AS-42 took that concept even further. An open body allowed large quantities of fuel, water, ammunition, and equipment to be carried while multiple weapons could be mounted around the vehicle. It sacrificed armor for range and flexibility, allowing Italian long-range patrols to operate deep in desert terrain. This was not a tank, it was a mobile weapons platform built around distance. Italian reconnaissance and raiding vehicles could reach the enemy, but every patrol, tank, and artillery piece still depended on something far less glamorous: trucks. Trucks and logistics. Dovunque 35. The Dovunque 35 was a general-purpose military truck designed around the reality that Italian forces had to move supplies across poor roads and difficult terrain. Its name, Dovunque, meaning everywhere, captured the ambition of the design. It carried troops, ammunition, equipment, and supplies that frontline vehicles could not operate without. Because a tank without fuel was not a weapon, it was a stationary target. Lancia 3-row. The Lancia 3-row was one of Italy's important heavy transport trucks, capable of carrying substantial loads over the long distances demanded by military logistics. Vehicles like the 3-row rarely appeared in the photographs that made tanks famous, but they were part of the system that kept those tanks moving. Fuel had to arrive. Ammunition had to arrive. Spare parts had to arrive. And damaged vehicles had to be recovered. That entire chain depended on transport. Fiat 626. The Fiat 626 filled the medium truck role and became one of the common workhorses of Italian military logistics. It transported troops and supplies across multiple theaters, connecting depots with the units actually doing the fighting. For an army operating far from its industrial base, vehicles like the 626 were just as important to operational mobility as its armored vehicles. Truck-mounted heavy guns. Autocannone da 90-53. Not every Italian anti-tank weapon needed tracks. The Autocannone da 90-53 mounted the powerful 90 mm gun on a heavy truck chassis, creating a highly mobile long-range weapon without the complexity of a purpose-built tank destroyer. Its gun could threaten heavily armored targets at considerable distance, but the truck offered little protection to the crew. It was another example of the same Italian solution. Take an existing platform, add the biggest weapon available. Accept the weaknesses. Autocannone da 90-53 su Lancia 3-row. The Lancia 3-row also served as a platform for heavy weapon systems, turning a logistics truck into a mobile artillery or anti-aircraft position. These vehicles were not armored fighting vehicles in the conventional sense, but they demonstrate how Italy repeatedly converted ordinary transport machines into battlefield weapons when purpose-built equipment was unavailable. Artillery tractors. Heavy guns created another problem that ordinary cargo trucks could not always solve. They had to be moved into position, often across terrain where roads were poor or non-existent. Breda 3251. The Breda tractor family provided specialized towing capability for artillery and heavy equipment, where ordinary trucks struggled. Its job was not to fight the enemy directly. Its job was to make sure the guns could get close enough to do it. Pavese P4. The Pavese P4 looked almost unlike a conventional military vehicle. Its articulated chassis allowed the front and rear sections to bend relative to each other, giving the tractor unusual mobility over broken terrain. Instead of steering like an ordinary truck, the vehicle effectively changed direction by bending its own frame. That strange solution addressed a very practical problem. How do you move a heavy gun when the road disappears? For Italy, the answer was sometimes to build a vehicle that could follow the gun almost anywhere. Recovery and command vehicles. Not every armored vehicle was designed to destroy something. Some existed to keep the others operating. Italy also employed recovery and maintenance vehicles based on existing tank chassis, allowing damaged or disabled armored vehicles to be towed away and returned to service rather than simply abandoned on the battlefield. Command variants performed an equally important function. By replacing or modifying the normal fighting equipment and adding additional radio equipment, command tanks gave armored formations mobile communications and control. A tank could win a fight, a recovery vehicle could save the tank, and a command vehicle could tell the rest of the formation where to fight. Motorcycles. Moto Guzzi Alci. The Moto Guzzi Alci was one of the standard Italian military motorcycles, used for dispatch riding, liaison, reconnaissance, and general transport duties. It was not glamorous. It did not have the armor of a tank or the firepower of a Semovente. But motorcycles could carry messages, move personnel, and maintain communications when larger vehicles could not. And in a war where armies were constantly trying to move men and information across difficult terrain, that mattered. The vehicle war behind the war. Italy's vehicle fleet reveals something that a list of tanks alone cannot. The problem was never simply finding a better armored vehicle. Every improvement created another requirement. A bigger gun needed more ammunition. A heavier tank needed more fuel. A damaged vehicle needed recovery. An artillery piece needed a tractor. A reconnaissance unit needed range. And every vehicle needed spare parts, mechanics, drivers, and roads capable of supporting it. Italy's engineers repeatedly tried to solve these problems with adaptation. The L3 Tankettes gave way to the L6/40. The M11/39 gave way to the M13/40 and its successors. When tanks could not carry enough firepower, the Semovente family put larger weapons onto existing chassis. When conventional reconnaissance vehicles were not enough, the AB series and Sahariana pushed mobility and range much further. And behind all of them, trucks, tractors, recovery vehicles, and motorcycles kept the entire system moving. Closing. Italy never fully closed the gap between what its army needed and what its industry could produce. The L3 Tankettes entered the war already vulnerable to modern anti-tank weapons. The M13/40 gave Italian armored divisions a workable medium tank, but could not overcome the growing advantages of Allied armor, production, and logistics. The P26/40 finally moved toward a more capable design, only to arrive too late to change the war. Yet the story was not simply one of failure. Italian engineers repeatedly adapted. The Semovente 75/8 turned an existing tank chassis into one of Italy's most effective armored fighting vehicles. The AB-41 gave reconnaissance units the speed, range, and firepower needed to operate across enormous distances. The Sahariana transformed a simple open vehicle into a long-range desert raider, and trucks, tractors, recovery vehicles, command vehicles, and motorcycles performed the less celebrated work that allowed the fighting machines to function at all. That is the real story of Italy's wartime vehicle fleet. Not one perfect tank, not one revolutionary machine, but an entire system of vehicles constantly being modified, repurposed, and pushed beyond what Italy's industrial base could comfortably support. On the battlefield, the tanks were the visible part of the war. Behind them was everything that kept them moving.